The JAR-5 Dominator has proven to be a solid option when facing off against the bugs. It has an immense stun to help you with the incoming horde, it makes quick work of medium-sized enemies, and it can even help you take down a charger in a pinch. But how will the JAR fare if we take it across the galaxy to face the Automatons? Surely this thing can't be better than King Scorcher, right? Dr. Pooplove here, and let's discuss. Now, up until this point, I have refused to believe the JAR was any good against the bots. The last time I tested this thing, it was pretty meh. The heavy rotation speed and recoil made it hard to face these robotic menaces at range, and the Scorcher seemed to just do a better job dishing out damage, especially with its ability to damage past heavy armor. But the JAR did receive a nice damage and stagger buff, and many people in the comments have told me that this is just a great option for bots. So I decided I need to see for myself. Now, I've covered this a couple times, but to quickly recap the stats on this thing, it dishes out a good bit of damage at 300, and it shares many stats with the Scorcher such as capacity, mag, and fire rate, which does make them comparable. But the JAR does have a higher recoil, and it also doesn't dish out this AoE explosion. The JAR does, however, have medium armor penetration, and it does dish out some nice stagger, which can help keep enemies at bay. But how does this thing actually do when you take it out for combat? Well, it's actually pretty awesome. Versus the little bots, it's a quick one shot. And really the hardest part is just lining that shot up so that you don't miss. But we'll talk about that. But another cool thing against the little bots is, just like the bugs, it does seem like collaterals are possible. Against the berserkers, this is very solid. Roughly 4 basic shots, which you can pump out very quickly to take these guys out. But what I love the most is the stun, which really keeps these guys chainsaw hands at bay. Walkers can also be taken out pretty nicely with a couple of crotch or leg shots. One thing to mention here, though, is that the JAR is much less effective against the walkers than the Scorcher, because the Scorcher can take them out by shooting directly at the faceplate. And although there are optional alternative targets like the crotch and the legs, the harder handling makes it a little bit harder to get your shots on target with the JAR. It does make these guys a little bit more noticeably difficult than the Scorcher, but regardless, it's still nice to be able to take them out from the front. And when you get used to it, you can do it a lot more effectively. Versus the Devastators though, the JAR really shines. It only takes a couple basic shots on their body to make quick work of them, but you should be aiming for the head because one well-placed headshot will take them out immediately. Versus the shielded Devastators, while you can't get hits through the shield like the Scorcher, one shot to the body will stagger them, causing them to swing their shield open so that you can continue to pump bullets in them more freely and finish them off pretty easily. Of course, a headshot is all you need though, so go for that if you can. Now, taking this to the Hulks, this really can't do anything to them from the front. I wasn't able to damage them in the face or the legs or the arms, so you will have to go around. A stun bomb can be a great combo for this because once you stun them, you can run around quickly, get a good angle, and the fast fire rate on the JAR can take these guys out pretty quickly. Now, versus the gunships, this can take them out by shooting their underside near the big red light. But I will say it takes a lot of shots and you end up kind of missing a lot because they're moving and the JAR's handling isn't the best. Definitely, I wouldn't use this unless you absolutely have to, but it is nice to have that option. And real quick, no, you cannot take the dropships out with this. And as another note too, don't expect the JAR to do much for utility. It doesn't have the ability to take out illegal broadcast towers, nor can it blow the doors off the side objectives, and obviously it doesn't have what it takes for the factories. A good pairing, if you are looking to have something at the ready that's good for utilities, is the grenade pistol, which can do all those things. Now moving on to the tanks. Versus the shredder tanks, the JAR can't penetrate the front plate like the Scorcher, but it can get at the side plates. So you can still take this thing out without directly hitting that weak spot in the back. But it will take a number of shots, so just be prepared for that. Versus the Annihilator tanks, you can shoot the tracks to immobilize it, or you can just simply go for the weak spot. I will say this is by far the biggest downside downside of the JAR versus the Scorcher, because the Scorcher can take those shredder tanks out very quickly through the front faceplate, and it will also dish explosive splash damage to the weak spots of the Annihilator tanks, so you don't even need direct hits to take those out. It's also going to be a similar thing here with the turret towers, as the Scorcher can get it with some angled splash damage, but with the JAR you need to get it directly on the weak spot. Now, while you can take this thing out pretty fast, the rotation will likely make it hard for you to get it all in one go, so you will likely have to circle around for a few follow-up shots. Now, versus the factory striders, I have to say, the JAR is surprisingly pretty good. Better than I thought. You can use it to take out the front turrets pretty quickly, which makes it much easier to roam around amongst this big guy without him giving you any damage. Now, the front eye and face, I couldn't really get any damage there, but to the underside of this thing, the JAR will dish out some good damage, especially when the hatch is open. And shooting the underside does give you the option to take this thing out totally and completely with just the JAR alone. What's also nice here is that because the factory produces Devastators, which the JAR is also particularly good against, the JAR does serve as a very great weapon to have with you around these factory striders. But yeah, damaging the underside is your best bet if you are only going to be using the JAR to try to take it out. It seems to take roughly 3 to 4 mags, but potentially a good deal less than that. I think it really just depends whether the hatch is open, but that's really not bad. It's obviously not your best option versus the striders, but in a pinch, it is pretty solid. I will say though that the Scorcher and even the Adjudicator, and actually likely any medium armor penetrating weapons, can also take out the factory strider from the underside. But at least in the initial testing, the JAR seemed to do it pretty quickly. Now, here's a couple tips for the JAR when facing off against the automatons. Firstly, you should definitely incorporate the first person view a lot, since bots are often at range and this thing has pretty bad recoil and handling. Going into first person is going to help you get on target better. In addition, you should be pre-aiming while roaming around, and it can be especially helpful if you do have your reticle visible, which you can enable in the settings. Doing this will allow you to watch your reticle and see when you are going to be ready to actually fire, and that can help you make better use of your bullets. I will also say that it does feel like the JAR will run out of ammo pretty quickly, so taking more time to aim before firing can help you out. But also, I would recommend saving those bullets for more of the medium targets, as that will make the most out of the damage output of this gun. You definitely don't need to use the JAR exclusively on gunships, tanks, or even factory striders. Even though you can take them out with it, I would make sure you have some heavy firepower options for them and save your JAR for the medium enemies. This is definitely going to be most effective versus berserkers, the devastators, and once you get the handle on it, walkers. All in all, I would say the JAR is a very solid option versus the bots. I would even say that after this buff, it does come very close to the Scorcher, especially being able to stagger the berserkers and make quick work of devastators, as well as just generally being an option that has the ability to take out pretty much every enemy. I don't think the JAR dethrones the Scorcher for me, but I totally understand if you feel this is at the top. But let me know what you think. And I also want to say a special thank you to my YouTube members for joining the Bowel Movement. But otherwise, so long, Pooper Troopers.